speakers. I want to thank everyone for being here. I see a lot of faces from my class. Obviously, the students are excited about this topic. We teach a class on the history of Puerto Rico and Cuba. And this project here began by accident. I traveled to Washington in 2012. I went to a conference. I decided to go one day before and one day after the conference so that I can look around. I decided to come to the Library of Congress, and I knew that they had a Puerto Rican memorial collection. I went in there just to glance at it. I had seen it before, but there was one particular box, number 7, that I had never seen. I didn't have any time the first time I looked at it. And I decided to go back, and out of curiosity, I wanted to see what was in that box. So I opened the box, and there was this one volume called Negros Emancipados, Filiaciones, or Liberated Slaves, Identity Markers. And I said, my goodness, I had to, what is this book doing in here? It's a mistake, or these are documents in this box, because this is a bounded book. I opened the book, and there are all 432 pages of each of the Africans that came on that particular ship, the Majesty, in 1859. And I was drawn to the book. I asked the librarian if I could make copies of the book. She said, you're happy to it, just put it under that machine. And I spent 2 hours, and I made PDF images, one by one, of 432 pages. So this is the result of it. I sat in my office. I recruited a student named Melina Aponte Resto, a political science student. She took the data from the book and put it on a spreadsheet. She actually deciphered the words that were in there, because this is written in 19th century paleography. So she put the data in, and then she also did some tables and graphs. And later on, I polished the tables and graphs and so on. So this is the result of it. When you think about Puerto Rico, and I know the class probably knows a lot about this already, but for the average person, when you think of Puerto Rico, do names like these come to mind? I don't know if you can see it from over there. Antomarchi, Oppenheimer, Stahl, Lebron, De Wint, Oxholm, Spinelli, Schomburg, Domenech. Does names like that come to mind? They don't come to mind?
French and German.
The
French and German.
They're French and German, but they're all Puerto Rican names, actually. There are people with those names in Puerto Rico. In fact, one of our judges, Judge Osmond, serves in Michigan, is a judge of Puerto Rican descent. Arturo Schomburg is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, the African-American, to some people, an African-American bibliographer who founded the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture. Aranzamendi was a Catalonian immigrant in Puerto Rico who lived in San Juan and was one of the leading slave traders in Puerto Rico. Pedreira is a Portuguese-sounding last name that came to Puerto Rico. O'Daly, I did a talk on him maybe a year ago. And the other one, this is a major botanist from Puerto Rico, Agustin Stahl. Oppenheimer, there's a guy named Boom Boom Oppenheimer. He plays the drum. And so he's got a German name, but he's actually a Puerto Rican conga drummer. And there are other names like that. What about these names? These are more common, right? Camacho, Trinidad. I purposely picked those two because they're boxers. You know, Trinidad and Camacho, El Bancho Camacho. And then Gomez, Vega, Gonzalez, Garcia, Rivera, and Rodriguez. Those are very typical names, so if you associate Puerto Ricans with that, you nailed it, because that's a typical. What about these names that are also part of Puerto Rican culture? I have you take a look at them before I say something about it.
Native Indian.
Indian names: Agüebaná, Guarionex, Urayoan, Anacanoa, Juiza, Caguax, Oropovics. I believe that Karen had family in Oropovics. Caunabo and Atuey. Everybody in the class knows Atuey, right? He was the Indian who was captured in Cuba, executed by the Spanish government burnt alive on a stake for not wanting to become a slave. What about these names? These are all the names. We don't have them in Puerto Rico today, but at one point we did.
African.
African names, Sika, Bemba, Izinga, their name would have been Nzinga, Zumbo, Fona, this name is still used, Jambo, Inquintela, Cumbele, Fafuga, and Kanga. I left the accent on purpose because they probably did not have an accent. The Spanish were good at putting accents on things. But we don't find these names today in Puerto Rico, but you find the faces. You find people who are of African descent in Puerto Rico who don't have those names. So the question then becomes, why don't we have those names in Puerto Rico today, right? And so if you ask that question, then it goes right back to Puerto Rican history, to the beginning of the European colonization of the island. And this is what the island of Puerto Rico looked like before 1492, before the Europeans landed in the New World. As you notice, all these divisions that you see there, territorial divisions, represent cacicatos, or cacique chiefdoms, that the island was divided on. The chief of the island was Agüeybaná, right here. And he basically was supposed to have been the leader of the entire island. All of the other local caciques worked with him. But the Spaniards, of course, came to the island of Puerto Rico, colonized the island, and the people that were of indigenous heritage were submerged into a sea of European immigrants that came to the island to colonize. And as a result, a lot of them felt obligated in some cases, or were forced in most cases, to adopt a Spanish identity, and that's why we don't know them today. And to some people, there's still remnants of the Indian culture in Puerto Rico, but to some others it's a fictive, made-up identity. But to me, it's a real identity. It's just a matter of locating, the connection between these various populations. The island at that time was known as Borinquen. You see the name right there. This is where we get the word Boricua. When people say that Puerto Ricans are Boricuas, what they really mean is that they are natives of Borinquen. The Spanish call it Puerto Rico because they thought it had a lot of gold, so they call it Richport. One of the reasons we don't know a lot about the Indians and Africans is because as part of the colonization of Puerto Rico, there has been a silencing of the past, right? The European colonizers were not interested in preserving the identity of the people they colonized. One of the things that they did when they came in was to try to force them into being something other than what they were originally. So they changed their identity. And as a result of that, we have suppressed a polyphonic totality. Where is my little pointer? This is a term coined by Gustavo Verdecio of Uruguay, who wrote a book on literature called Forgotten Conquest, and he came up with this term, polyphonic totality. It just means that a lot of the voices of the past, they are diverse, but we don't see those voices or hear those voices because they have been forcibly suppressed. When you have colonialism, of course, you use force to force the people to submit. Then you destroy their culture, their values, religion, last names, their ways of life, even their cuisine. And then you institutionalize a system of oppression to make sure that they act in the way that you would like them to act in a colonized mindset. Puerto Rico underwent this transformation as a result of the Spanish colonization of the island, so that from 1492 to about the beginning of the 18th century, the island was on the periphery, on the fringes of the Spanish Empire. And then in the 18th century, it underwent a transformation. And all of a sudden, the Spanish wanted to make money out of the island, so they introduced commercial agriculture. And in order to carry out commercial agriculture on an island that was sparsely populated, they needed a labor force that they could control. So they started importing Africans. And this Africanization of Puerto Rico that began in the second half of the 18th century continued until about the latter part of the 19th century, until about 1870. In 1873, the abolition of slavery will take place in Puerto Rico, and officially slavery will be over. But there was a moment in 1807 when the island of Puerto Rico became the target of discussions that were going on internationally regarding the continuation of the slave trade. England had decreed the abolition of slavery, and it forced Spain to sign a number of treaties in 1817, 1820, 1835, and 1845 to basically stop, to see the introduction of enslaved Africans to the Hispanic Caribbean. That would have been the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Dominican Republic will become free right around the 1820s, and they will declare the independence in 1844, permanently breaking it away from the Spanish Empire. But Puerto Rico and Cuba continued to be part of the empire, the Spanish Empire. Now, according to this author right here, Ibrahim Sundiata, he examined the history of Puerto Rico, and particularly the relationship between Puerto Rico and the African diaspora. Diaspora, of course, means migration. And he argued that one of the defining characteristics of Puerto Rican history is that it has an ambiguous relationship with Africa. The Puerto Ricans do not recognize, do not embrace blackness, that they are somehow separated from the currents of African diasporic discussion that take place in the rest of the Americas, particularly in places like Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, Barbados, and other places like that. And so in his view, there's a certain ambiguity that you see in Puerto Rico that makes him sort of not be sure-footed about whether or not they want to recognize the African contribution to Puerto Rican culture. I would argue that that term ambiguity is not an accurate term. That while there may be people who are ambiguous about their black identity in Puerto Rico for a lot of different reasons, the real fact is that Puerto Rico was in the middle of the African diaspora at different points from the beginning of the Spanish colonization. In 1505, the island began importing enslaved Africans, and that continued from 1505 for about 500 years after that. So there's no ambiguity there. What is there is duplicity. This is a term coined by my good friend Joseph Dorsey, an African-American professor who embraced Puerto Rican history, became in love with the island, learned Spanish, learned Portuguese, and actually did a lot of work that has changed our understanding of Puerto Ricans' participation, of Puerto Rico's participation in the slave trade. He said that duplicity is the best term because what the Spanish did was that they agreed in principle not to bring slaves, but in practical terms, they continued to bring slaves. Now, how did they pull this off, right? How do you say in writing, no more slaves, but in actuality, you do allow slaves in? He said that they did it by subterfuges, strategies that the Spanish government used to disguise the African provenance of the people from Africa that they brought in. So all of a sudden, they're not African. They may be black, but they're not African. If they are African, they are subject to those treaties, which means that Spain is breaking the law. By not calling them African, they become black, and now you don't have to worry about the consequences of violating the treaty. So that's just one of the techniques that the Spanish government used to hide the African identity of the slave. This is Michael Zuski. He's a German author. Also, he's at the forefront of modern day studies on the African diaspora. He's one of the leading scholars currently writing about the migration, forceful migration of Africans to places like Cuba. He specializes in Cuba. one of the contributions that he has made to the field is his argument that because of the duplicitous behavior that the Spanish had towards the slave trade, they had to conceal the identity of the Africans. They had to find a way to integrate Africans into the second slavery that emerged in Puerto Rico during the 19th century. In other words, after England declared the abolition of the slave trade, Puerto Rico underwent a transformation and now has embraced what they call a second slavery. This is an illegal slavery. In other words, the slave trade is abolished, it's illegal, and the Spanish government is violating it by permitting the immigration of enslaved Africans into Puerto Rico. So this is what they call the second slavery. And according to Michael, what the Spanish government did was that they literally wrote the Africans into the second slavery. Now, how did they achieve this? Normally, you don't write people into anything that way, right? You don't take a person and you write them into slavery. You have to force them to do things, right? If you're going to have a slave, obviously you're going to have force. You just don't write them into it. But what he really means is symbolic writing. What the Spanish did was that they relied on curas. What are curas? Anyone?
Priests.
Priests, notaries, and government officials, and all of these three people teamed up to essentially misidentify Africans on the records by labeling them, changing their identity from Africans to something else. In many cases, they call them emancipados. And this term is very tricky because literally the word emancipado means emancipated, freed, or liberated, non-slave anymore, right? But in the Spanish Caribbean, emancipados meant disguised slavery. It meant that you are seen by people as a slave and treated as one, even though the title of your status indicates that you are free. So, since a lot of these people were illegal, in the sense that the Spanish had signed these treaties, they could not recognize them as Africans. That's the ambiguity that Sundiata earlier was speaking about. It's not that Puerto Ricans don't embrace their blackness, it's that blackness was erased on purpose. Huh? And because it was erased on purpose, people do not acknowledge it. It is almost as though the Africans went underground in Puerto Rico. They disappear into this new status of emancipados, right there, emancipated. And so how did the Spanish do this? Well, they used at least three approaches, right? If you review the records of the Spanish government dealing with the arrival of enslaved people in Puerto Rico from Africa, and you ask the same officials, what about that ship? What about that individual over there? The first response was, I don't see them. What are you talking about? Where are they? You mean that black person? That black person is not an African. It's a black person. That other person? No, he's an emancipado. Not an African. So the first act was to create a silencing of the Africans, a forceful forgetfulness of the Africans. They have been eradicated from the record from this point forward. The second step, if they could not succeed in convincing people that they don't exist, is to deny that they ever landed in Puerto Rico. Which ship? When? What time? What day? Who saw it? You have evidence. You have witnesses. Could it be that they saw another ship? Maybe it was a merchant ship. Maybe they didn't see a ship. Maybe it was a small boat. Maybe people see things, you know. So that was the second strategy, to deny that the landing ever took place. The government cannot be everywhere. That was kind of the argument, right? The third strategy, if pressed against the wall to tell the truth, the officials then resorted to saying that the enslaved Africans that came to Puerto Rico were Latinos. Hispanized blacks or Hispanicized blacks who came from the Eastern Caribbean under some type of license authorized by the government. So these are legal. You know why? Because the treaty said that you cannot bring Africans from Africa. This is the Eastern Caribbean. This is not Africa. So you made the argument that the treaties were not violated because the slavers, the ships that went and captured them, never went to Africa. They went to the Caribbean, here. This is very interesting because what it does, what it reveals, is that in Puerto Rico, a concerted, deliberate effort was done to erase these images of enslaved Africans coming into the island and to prevent people from seeing them. Yeah.
I thought according to the Catholic canonical law, only the Africans were allowed to be enslaved in the way because they had the chance
Right,
to
but
convert to Christianity, as opposed to the natives who hadn't seen Christianity yet and hadn't rejected it to fall into slavery. So if the Africans, if the blacks hadn't come to Africa, don't they lose the eligibility to become slaves because they hadn't rejected Christianity?
not at this stage, because at this stage, religion doesn't play a role yet. The justification of enslavement for Native Americans happened here because the Indians were here. The Africans are overseas. So the justification does not apply in this particular case. Most of the people who engage in the enslavement of Africans did not necessarily use religion. They use religion once you bring them on to the island and you try to justify their arrival by saying that they need to be converted, but not before. So they use other justifications. Let me come over here now and ask myself, if there are no black people in Puerto Rico, what are these people doing in Puerto Rico? This is Cortijo Sucombo, one of the major groups on the island. They look pretty Puerto Rican to me. And some of them look pretty black. Could they be the descendants of these non-existent Africans that came to Puerto Rico? Perhaps, right? Well, if you ask every Puerto Rican, they'll tell you there's many people who look like this on the island. What about this other group, El Gran Combo? They've been paying for 55 years. They're the hottest group in Puerto Rico. They travel the world, every place in the world. We are black, some of them. What about mofongo? And if you go to Puerto Rico, you go to New York City, you have to have mofongo. Mofongo is an African dish. Every Puerto Rican eats mofongo. Where did they learn that from? Not from the Africans, they didn't come, remember? They invented this dish. Maybe this maestro Rafael Cordero, who taught children in Puerto Rico for free in the 19th century, maybe he didn't live. We probably concocted this picture and put it in the internet because there were no Africans in Puerto Rico. And of course, Sammy Davis Jr. never really existed, nor did he ever play bongos. His mother, a Puerto Rican woman, probably would be very confused if I told her that her son does not live, never lived. Sammy Davis Jr.'s mother was Puerto Rican. How about Arturo Alfonso Schomburg? The Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture was created by him in 1936 in New York City, in a place now called Malcolm X Boulevard, formerly Lenox Avenue in Harlem. Maybe he's another invention. We created another Puerto Rican out of the air and gave him a black identity. And the young lords, they don't exist either, right? All of these Puerto Ricans that were fighting in the 1960s for civil rights in the United States, no, we probably created those too. But to me, they're not really created. Those are real people. I remember some of them. I'm of that generation. Yeah, they are. They were real to me when I saw them. See, what really happened in Puerto Rico is that Puerto Rico was a part of the international globalized trade called the triangular trade system. In this trade system, as you can see here, the Europeans from somewhere here will sell products to the kings and queens on the west coast of Africa initially. Later on, they will go here to East Africa, and they will go to Central Africa here, and they will trade those cheap goods, low-value goods, for humans that they will later transport in the Middle Passage to places like Puerto Rico, and then they will use the Africans here to grow coffee, tobacco, cotton, sugar, and a lot of other products. And these raw materials will then be shipped over here to Europe, England, Scotland, Ireland, Spain, and France, and Germany. And this same goods, these materials, will then be refashioned here and sold back to the Africans and back to the Americas, all packaged. So the labor of the Africans here is stolen from Africa, exploited here, and to produce goods that benefit the industrialization of Europe. And in 1859, the deception game that the Spanish had going for a while blew up in their face when all of a sudden one of the ships got stranded at nighttime when they were attempting to land 1,000 slaves in Puerto Rico. And all of a sudden the Spanish had to confront the fact that the Africans did not exist. Now they had to, remember what Zuski said? They had to write them into the slavery game. And so now the Africans had to be identified, because under the treaty that Spain signed with England, once you capture a ship that is introducing slaves illegally, you have to identify the African, write their names in African, in whatever language they came from, and something about their identities, their ages, their gender, their height, as much information as you can, put that in the ledger, and then save it at the Library of Congress, so that Jorge Chinea, 500 years later, will find it on a trip 2 years ago. That same document that started in this city right here, when this ship that's coming from this direction gets stranded in here, and the government seizes it. So isn't that interesting? Now, what do you do with the cargo? Well, the cargo was appropriated by the people in that community immediately. They started going into the ship and grabbing Africans and taking them to the plantations. And only about 500 of them, maybe 600, remain on the ship. They were taken to San Juan here, and in here they built a barracks, and they put them all in there. They jotted down the information on that book that I told you that I found in the Library of Congress 2 years ago. So who are these Africans? This is a picture not from that era, but from 1860, 1 year afterwards. Notice the large number of children in this picture. In our case, the Majesty case, 60% were children. That is people identified as 15 years old or younger. 60%. If you have people that were all the way to the age of 19, I would call those pre-adults, then the number is 80%. So the African slave trade in the second slavery in the Caribbean was an enslavement of young men and women, children. So this is the material that I found, the U.S. Library of Congress Manuscript Division, Box 7, Negros Emancipados, Filiaciones. And then I I found a student to help me input the data. And these are some of the names. This is just an example. This document is probably about 15 pages long, 439 names. And you cannot see the names from that way because it's very, very small. This is Sika, Dosao, Soki, Macumbe, Sasoeto, Buritande, Guete Agüemba, Wingoni, and Sumbo. This is the name that the Spanish gave them. Agapito, Adolfo, Alberto, Alejandro, Ambrosio, Anacleto, Anastasio, Andres, and Aniceto. And they went like this through the entire alphabet, finding names all the way to 432. Each name was a name out of the Bible somewhere, and they gave the Africans a new name. So these are not Africans anymore, right? Their identity is being changed. These are their ages over here, 20, 20, 20, 16, 20, 20, 24. These are some of the older ones. As I mentioned, 80% are young people. This is a number over here. I want to show you this. You see this? Tag number. When they came into that location in San Juan, when they shipped them into this location, the barracks, they created a plate, a metal plate in copper or tin, and they hung it on their shoulder here, on their chest. And it had a name. From now on, you will be a number, not a name, a number. And so they use two ways to take away the African identity. They refer to the Africans by the number. Today we give him 422, it's going to go to this plantation. 423 is going to go to that other plantation, and so on. And then they call them by this new name. Right? They lost their identity. Here are some of the people who appropriated the slaves, or the enslaved Africans in this case. And I don't know that you can see their names from that way, but these are the people. And you know what? I'm publishing this article in a journal in Brazil, and I'm sure the descendants of some of these people will be very happy to see their names in here. Maybe not. They're not going to be too happy when I say that. Are you a Swaga? Maybe this guy's an ancestor. He owned 10 slaves right here. 6 were children, 9 were adults. You know, I got all of these names. I have about 95% of the people who took control of these enslaved children. I know exactly who they are and where they live. Cannot find them. It's been, what, 200 years? But I know who they are right here. Mariani, Machicote, Lindegren. This guy was the son of the Spanish consul in Puerto Rico. Actually, the British consul in Puerto Rico, I should say. Yeah, he took quite a few of them. He changed his name to Guillermo to fit in. His name is William. Here is Domingo Boltres. He's probably French. There's a couple of Antucci's, Corsican or Italian. Fern, I don't know where Fern is. But you can see the number of children that went to each person and what they do with them. Here are the numbers of deaths. I documented 165 out of 432 that survived died within 5 years of arriving in Puerto Rico. And I found out exactly how they died and when they died and where they died and in what cemetery they're located. So you can actually use this for genealogical purposes, go back and actually retrace the African origins of some families in Puerto Rico. And here are their names. In Spanish, I also had the African name, like Lembrido. I didn't put them all in here because I didn't have any room on the paper. This is the tin plate that shows that this is the plate that they had on their shoulder. This is the information that was also in that book. The Spanish were very meticulous about writing any marks or scars that the Africans had on their bodies. The Africans carried scarification as part of West African cultures. And so the Spanish indicated where the scar was, and I tabulated the location: shoulder, arm, head, leg, back, abdomen, cheek, chest, eyebrow, neck, lips, jaw, nipples, wrist, ear, foot, hand, and none. Notice that 132, 1/3 of the Africans, had scars on the shoulder. If they carry that mark on the shoulder prior to coming to Puerto Rico, that means that they already have been tagged for enslavement in Africa. If they did not have that mark on their bodies prior to coming to Puerto Rico, they were decorative or other forms of scars, not necessarily enslavement marks. But I jotted down the different kinds of and the percentages that you find these on their bodies. And it's a very good piece of information. You can actually use this information to locate places in Africa where those body marks are found, and that will tell you where those people in Africa came from, potentially. This is some of the unusual marks that I found, and some of the people that had them: Pindi, Masum, Sirimpundu, Diakude, Bemba, Inkela. This is some of their names, and this is the marks that you found in their bodies. One person had the word fe stamped on the shoulder. Fe in Spanish, it means faith. They came with that from Africa. That was not written on their arrival to Puerto Rico. This tells me that that particular person came from Angola, which is still under Portuguese control. And in Africa, some of the families will write fe to protect the children from enslavement. In this case, it did not work, obviously. So they captured this particular individual. But these are the shapes that you find. You know, some of them in the shape of an 8, of a 5, of a star, of a cross. These are the average ages of the Africans. Look at the percentages of Africans that were young. 30% in 1775, about the same number in 1800, and by 1826, 1850, it goes up to 40%. So the shipment that came to Puerto Rico was in line with the continual human trafficking of African children that was taking place in Africa. I got this number from a source that you can all consult called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. You could consult it online. It has 38,000 ships that were consulted, and then they looked at the individuals that were found on the ships, and then they tabulated the numbers. The numbers amounted to something like 12.5 million Africans that landed in the New World. The numbers that actually left Africa, you had to add a percentage, a factor of 3 to 30%, because that's the numbers that died en route. So in this particular case, there may have been more than the 900 or 1,000 that we discovered in the Majesty in Puerto Rico. There could have been 1,500, and maybe 30% died en route, and only 1,000 landed in Puerto Rico. These are the ages of the ones that I found in the Majesty. 7 to 10 years old, 154. Of 432. This is just the total of the ones with the ages. 35%, 19%. When you add these two numbers, you got a lot of numbers right there. You got about 60%. So that's it. I just wanted, I think I ran out of time. What time is it?
You have 15 more minutes
You're out of time.
for discussion.
Okay. Where is there we go. Okay. So, this is the beginning of a work of attempting to identify the origins of enslaved Africans that came to Puerto Rico. In order to do this, what I had to do was to go back and read up everything that I could on the history of Africa and the African slave trade, and correlate that information against the Majesty, including scarification data, ages, genders, and linguistic evidence. Just by linguistic evidence, I was able to identify the potential areas in Africa, in the Congo region, where a lot of the people that came on the Majesty came from. So it's not a sure shot. One cannot say for sure that they came from this particular region in the Congo region, but you are probably going to be real close to the area just on the linguistic evidence alone. And then you look at the patterns of shipments coming from Africa, in particular in the young population. West Central Africa was the leading exporter of children in the 1830, 1860, the leading exporter of children. And it was also one of the areas that exported the least amount of women and females. And so more women were being exported from other regions in Africa. There are at least 7 regions in Africa, 7 regions that are known to be high spot for the exportation of enslaved Africans. The Congo region was, at this particular time, 1830, 1860, the more dominant at that time. About 90% of enslaved Africans that came to the Americas, 1830 to 1850, came from the Congo region, the Congolese. Today, the Congo is divided into at least 4 countries: Cabinda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo Republic, and Angola. And so the Congo Kingdom broke down and is today 4 or 5 different countries. So it's kind of hard to try to find out more about this information, but if you do a little bit of digging around, you can actually put an identity and a human face. To me, this was important for this following reason. I think that too often Africans come across as nameless people, numbers. So many were chipped here, right? And what I'm trying to do is put a human face to them and identify the human qualities that are being eroded and silenced by the slave traders, and try to recover some of that information and hopefully begin a process where people will, look at this information and find value for genealogical purposes and other reasons. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope I presented what I found at this point. I'm probably going to go back and continue to dig into this more. Right now, I divided the material into 2 different chapters. One chapter is going to come out in a book in the Dominican Republic, and one chapter is going to come out in a journal in Brazil. So that's my presentation. Thank you for paying attention. If you have any comments or reactions, questions, I'll be happy to entertain them.
Okay, I got to head up class, but is there a reason or many reasons why there's an increase in the number of children over the centuries? I mean, is it because the end of the slave trade, they wanted kids to grow up, or is it because there were too many adults that had been sent before? Or
both.
Or
Too
maybe
many
more kids
adults
on the
have been
ship?
targeted at the beginning of the slave trade, and because of the wars, men were targeted for elimination, leaving a lot of orphan children. A lot of the children that are in the Majesties are orphans. They're children that became second-class citizens within African society, and therefore easy to prey on. And also, according to the literature, children were more vulnerable, more impressionistic. You can scare them more into getting into a ship. You couldn't do that to an adult. An adult will fight you on the ship and try to become free. Children do not have that option as much as an adult will have. Handout. Oh, who had the handout? Yeah.
I was just wondering, could you fit more kids on a ship too?
On the what?
Could you fit more kids on a ship too?
You can fit in more children, and also they were allowed to roam on the ship. They were allowed to walk around and move around. Unlike adults, they were chained up at the bottom of the ship. Other reactions or questions? Yes.
There's a generic Puerto Rican identity that doesn't differentiate between black and brown, and that's because of this duplicity with the Spanish law
That is part of it. That's part of it, but the other part of it is that when the Spanish came to Puerto Rico, they developed a caste system, an organizational form of society that privileged whiteness. So many people eventually learned to privilege whiteness over blackness.
but didn't differentiate between black and brown.
Right. Well, they could differentiate between black and brown. Mulatto, for example, is brown. But more and more people identify themselves as brown rather than black because of that tendency to ignore the African heritage and to embrace whiteness. Other reactions, questions? Yeah.
What was the impetus for the British and Spanish, or the anti-slaving treaties?
Why did they sign them?
Yeah.
They needed money and they needed protection. Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808. The British offered Spain that they would send the military to rescue them if you sign the treaty. If you sign the treaty, we'll come and rescue you. And the English did rescue the Spanish from the Napoleonic invasion. That's not to say that the Spanish did not fight, they did. But the British were instrumental in helping them. So the Spanish then found themselves obligated to sign the treaty. Yeah.
Jorge, what work is continuing in Puerto Rico now that really not only supports this, but keeps it alive as far as?
There are many organizations in Puerto Rico. The island is undergoing a renaissance in terms of African identity. We have numerous groups. The ones that you saw there are the standards. Those groups have always been there. The ones that I began with, they've always been there, but they're black. It's just that they don't call themselves black groups. But there are today modern day groups of Puerto Rican that are recovering their black identity, and as much as they're also recovering the Indian identity. On the internet, there's a couple of Indian nations from Puerto Rico that people can subscribe and become a member. Yeah, you could become an Indian in cyberspace, you know. And so, no, there's a lot of that. But then the other groups also had their own interest groups. There are people in Puerto Rico that have organizations of Germans, you know, histories of Corsica migration, Canary Island migration, Italian migration, and so on and so forth. That's still alive in Puerto Rico.
What about other areas of Mexico broadly?
In Mexico, it's a little different because the Spanish did not continue colonizing Mexico at the 1810.
Okay.
But in Mexico, there are regions in Mexico that have continued to have black presence. In fact, we established a program, a study abroad program, in a place called Cihuatanejo, to invite people from Wayne State to study in this particular region of Mexico, which is traditionally a black Mexicano community. I think you went there.
Yes, I just
Yeah,
went there the end of February, and it's just amazing the connection that we all have. And I'm looking forward to going back.
And one of the Calis of Hernan, Talia Cisneros, was the one who helped broker the deal to get that university to sign an MOU with Wayne State. Other reactions? Yeah.
I checked my head, this is right in the height of the Civil War in the US.
At the end, by the time these people, by 1865, by the way, I didn't say this, but in 1865, the Spanish government in Spain decreed that these particular emancipados needed to be formally set free. But then they insisted that they be transformed into what they call day workers, which meant that they never really shed their identity as either forced workers or compulsory workers or servile workers, because they still had to have supervision from the government, who insisted that they had to get jobs and so on and so forth. But yeah, this happened at the end. When they became free is when the United States declares the Emancipation Proclamation.
Was there a school that, God forbid, that thought the South would win and slavery would go back into effect full force?
Well, at that particular point, what's interesting for our purposes is that when the slavery was abolished in the U.S., there was an annexation movement in Cuba. There were many people in Cuba that were hoping to make Cuba part of the United States, and when the U.S. declared emancipation, they pulled back, and they decided to embrace independence. But there were many people in Cuba who wanted to imitate the Southern way of life, of having, slaves forever and ever and ever. Once abolition occurred here, then the Cubans could not join the U.S. or would not be able to join the U.S. Puerto Rico did not have one of those movements at that particular time. In part because there were fewer Africans in Puerto Rico. Remember that they silenced them. And so when we say that there were fewer, it's a relative term, because we're talking about people who are consciously reducing the numbers to prevent Africans from being seen as African. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.